Hey guys, Larki here, coming to you live from editing. I don't know why this footage looks super orange, and I tried filming this video twice and it was not cooperating with me. I didn't realize how orange it was until now, so I want to give you guys a heads up. Sorry about that. Enjoy the video. Bye.
Hey guys, welcome back to my channel. If you're new here, hi, my name is Larki. I make lifestyle and true crime videos. If you're not, welcome back and thank you for joining me for another video. Today's video is a true crime video, and the case that we're going to be talking about comes from Chicago in the mid-1920s. And this case became pretty popular in Chicago. As we get into it, you guys will see why. It kind of pretty much shocked a lot of people, and it was pretty talked about at the time. Because of the media attention this case got to be known as the Mystery of the Ragged Stranger, or simply the Ragged Stranger. If you want to take a deep dive into this case, there's a really good podcast by the name The Mystery of the Ragged Stranger that you guys can check out. I'll make sure to link it down below. There are some parts of this case that it's just speculation, so I won't be going into that too deeply, but the podcast does a really good job at addressing all of this. I'll be sticking to just the facts with this case. And without further ado, let's go ahead and get into today's video. So the story starts with Carl and Ruth Wanderer.
Ruth was born on December 27th, 1898, to Eugenia Johnson and Charles Johann Johnson.
And Ruth was a child of 5. She was the middle child, born just 2 days after Christmas. She was a shy girl who loved to sing. She was part of the church choir, and her family lived 2 blocks away from church, so they never missed service. And Ruth and Carl had a connection from childhood, really. Ruth's mother made her and her brother walk 2 miles to the Wanderer butcher shop because she thought that they were the best in town. So Ruth would see Carl there since he was the son of the butcher.
Carl was born on June 26, 1895, to Charlie and Anna Wanderer.
He had 2 sisters, and one was actually his twin sister, Laura. They were inseparable in childhood. In the 4th grade, they switched to a new school, and for the first time, they were in separate classes. This kind of gave Carl the chance to grow into his personality a little bit, but he did become quite a bit of a rebel. He was a class clown and would get into trouble at school. And thankfully for him, Laura's handwriting was very similar to her mom, so she would sign all the notes that he would get sent home with. And this saved him some trouble with his parents, but he was still very much a rule breaker. He would stay out past curfew and had to sleep in the street because his parents would lock him out. Carl's mother was extremely religious, and she did suffer from mental health issues. At one point, she insisted that the voices in her head kept telling her to move to Tennessee, specifically to God's country. And no one really knew what area this meant specifically, but she wanted to move out to the farm. She wanted to get out of Chicago and wanted to get out of the city. And Carl's father, Mr. Wanderer, he was inclined to do this, but he couldn't really leave the butcher shop on its own, since that was what supported the family. So Mr. Wanderer sent Carl, his sisters, and Carl's mother down to Tennessee. There, they purchased 40 acres of land, and they set up a vegetable farm in a little town called Deer Lodge. The kids' days would consist of attending to the farm and going to church, and there wasn't really anything else to do besides that. The kids would spend a lot of time in the church, and this was because this was the only way that they could escape their mother's manic ways. So they would spend their mornings in church, head home for lunch, and then return back to church for the evening service. And they didn't really get a break from their day-to-day life. They did get to go to Chicago a few times a year, like for birthdays or holidays, or their father would come down to visit them in the farm. But besides that, they had no other escape. And Carl grew tired of this really quickly. He was the only boy in the family, so he was considered to be the man of the house, and he was expected to do most of the handiwork around the farm. One day at the age of 17, he had decided that he had enough, so he woke up early and headed into town to enlist in the army. And since he was underage, he forged his mother's signature to be ordered to sign up. Carl got up that morning determined to start his new life, and he didn't leave a note behind or instructions on the upkeep of the farm or anything. So not only was his family left behind without really any idea how to tend to the farm, but they also had no idea where Carl was or what was up with him. Like, why did he just randomly leave? They wouldn't have an update up until weeks later when they received a letter from Carl in the mail, and he was telling them that he had joined the army. In this letter, Carl explained that he was stationed in Ohio and he was doing a 3-year tour. During this time, Carl's mother's condition got worse, and the farm also failed because without Carl's help there wasn't anyone to really tend to the farm or do any of the handiwork, as I mentioned. So Carl's mother and his sisters had to return to Chicago. So Carl and his family moved down to Tennessee to help with his mother's mental state, and moving back to Chicago didn't help them at all. One day, Carl's mother, Anna, woke up in the middle of the night and she was in such a fright. She explained that she had a nightmare in which Carl had been hanged, and she was just freaking out. And the family was able to calm her down and let her know that Carl was safe and he was at the army base that he was stationed at in Texas at the time. And they were able to, calm her down and get her back into bed. Unfortunately, though, the family woke up the next morning to find that Anna had committed suicide. In the middle of the night, she had slit her throat, and this just devastated them because it was so unexpected. So Carl was granted leave to go attend his mother's funeral. Now, Carl took this news pretty roughly. While he was back at home, he was kind of down, his mother had just committed suicide while he was away. So he spent a lot of time with his cousin Frank, and Frank was kind of like his right-hand man in the sense where he was trying to cheer him up and lighten up his mood. So at one point, they had a bit of a get-together, and at the get-together, Carl spotted a familiar face. Carl realized that this was one of his old customers at the butcher shop, Ruth. So he reintroduced himself and they hit it off right away. They instantly felt a connection, and right at that get-together, Carl had asked Ruth if she wanted to be pen pals with him while he was away at the army, and Ruth accepted, and they started exchanging letters while Carl was away. After his leave, Carl returned to the army to finish his tour, and he returned back home to Chicago in 1915. When Carl returned home, he worked alongside his father at the butcher shop. While all this was going on, his romance with Ruth grew. They were pretty happy with each other, but unfortunately, Ruth's mother, Mrs. Johnson, did not approve. She didn't want Ruth dating until she was 18, and she was only 17 at the time. Although Mrs. Johnson didn't approve, Carl and Ruth would see each other whenever they could. And since they had mutual friends through Carl's cousin Frank, they were able to find the time to see each other. When World War I started and men were getting drafted for war, Carl knew that he would get drafted due to his past service, so he re-enlisted in 1917. Against Mrs. Johnson's wishes that Ruth was too young for such a serious relationship, Carl and Ruth kept in touch through love letters. And in one of these letters, Carl proposed and Ruth accepted, and they were soon engaged. When Carl's enlistment ended, he returned home and he and Ruth were married on October 1st of the year 1919. They moved into an apartment with Ruth's parents, and Carl went back to work at his father's butcher shop. Now, the apartment that they lived in was pretty small. It was a 2-bedroom apartment. So Ruth's parents were in one bedroom and Carl and Ruth were in another. Now, one of Ruth's brothers also lived with them, and he stayed in the sunroom, which they kind of turned into like a makeshift bedroom. And not too long after they got married, right around Christmas of that year, the couple found out that they were expecting a new addition to their family. Ruth was over the moon. She enjoyed married life as it was, so she was excited for the baby. She was known to be a pretty good seamstress, so she would often be seen by people knitting little clothes for the baby, like little socks and things like that. Carl, however, might have not been as excited as Ruth, and this was something that those around him started to notice, particularly Ruth's mother, Mrs. Johnson, but it was one of those things that everyone kind of kept to themselves. June 21st of the year 1920 started out like any other day for the Wanderers. Carl and Ruth had breakfast with her parents, and at breakfast, Carl had asked Ruth if they wanted to go see a movie that night, and they were going to go see the film adaptation of Jack London's The Lone Sea Wolf. That night, Carl and Ruth went out for their date at the Pershing Theater, and at around 9 p.m., so in the middle of the movie, Carl had asked Ruth if they could leave early because he wasn't feeling too well, and Ruth agreed, so they started walking home. On their way home, they passed the pharmacy on Lincoln Street, and Carl nodded to a passerby. Nothing really seemed out of the ordinary. When they got home, Ruth walked up the stoop while Carl waited at the foot of the steps. Ruth had struggled to get the front door open since the vestibule was so dark, but as she got the door open and Carl walked inside, she said that she would turn on the light in the overhead lamp that they had inside. While this was happening, she didn't notice a stranger that had walked in right behind Carl. The next thing she knows is that somebody responded to her, "Don't turn on that light, how about that money?" Before she could realize what was going on, gunshots were fired and Ruth realized that she had been shot. As Ruth had cradled her belly while laying in the vestibule, Carl had struggled with the stranger and another round of shots was heard. Now by this point, Ruth's mother, Mrs. Johnson, had heard the commotion, so she ran outside to see what was going on. When Carl saw her, he yelled out to her to let her know that Ruth had been shot. And by this point, Ruth had been breathing heavily and she was bleeding a lot. They knew that it would take too long for the ambulance to get to them. In that moment, they knew that Ruth was dying. One of their neighbors, James Williams, had heard the commotion and had called the police. So while waiting for the police, Carl and Mrs. Johnson waited by Ruth's side as she took her last few breaths. Following the murder, Carl got a lot of sympathy from the media and he was labeled a bit of a hero. I mean, not only did he lose his wife and his unborn child, but he was also able to fight off their assailant and fight for their honor. Carl was happy to play the hero part, and he had the story ready for anyone who asked. For 18 days, Carl played this part. In total, Ruth sustained 2 bullet wounds and the stranger 3, and there were other bullet holes in the walls and the floor of the vestibule. However, Carl didn't even have a single scratch left from the attack. Police quickly became suspicious and they asked Carl why he had been carrying a gun with him at the time. Carl answered by saying that he had recently gotten robbed and he had been carrying around his army-issued pistol ever since. Police's suspicions only grew when they saw the type of gun that Carl had because it was the same type of gun that the stranger had been carrying. Both weapons were Colt M1911 .45 caliber semi-automatic handguns. The gun had been registered to a Peter Hoffman, and when questioned by police, he had told them that he had sold the gun in the year 1914 to a person named Ruth Wanderer, who turned out to be Carl's cousin. When Fred was questioned by police, he had admitted that he had loaned the gun to Carl. With this information, police arrested Carl on July 6, 1920, and they questioned him for 16 hours straight. 2 days later, a 17-year-old girl by the name of Julia Schmidt walked into the police office to give them information on the case. Julia was surprised to hear about Ruth's murder because, as far as she was concerned, Carl was her boyfriend, and she had no idea that Carl was married, let alone with a baby on the way. She had learned about the murder on the news, and her mother kind of forced her to go to the police and tell them what she knew. Police questioned Carl, and he of course denied everything. He said that Julia was just some kid who had a crush on him, but Julia stuck to her story. She said that they had been on 6 dates and had exchanged love letters. She said that Carl had even kissed her. When Julia turned in the love letters to the police, they found that some of the letters were written before the murder and some were written as recent as after the murder. So now some sources say that when Carl was presented with the information about Julia, he confessed to the murder in interrogation. Other sources note that Carl confessed during an inquest that was held after police found out about Julia. Nonetheless, Carl admitted to the murder. He said that he had gotten tired of getting married and he wasn't thrilled about being a father either. He started dating Julia a bit before the murder and he wanted to re-enlist in the army. But he had no plans of murdering Ruth up until the day of the murder. That very morning that he had breakfast with his in-laws and Ruth and made plans to go to the movie theater. But before killing her, he wanted to make sure that he got all of her money. So Carl told Ruth that it was time for them to get their own home, with a baby on the way. So he told her to withdraw all of the money that she had in savings at the bank to get it ready for a down payment on the house. And Ruth went and she withdrew $1,500 from her bank account, which is equivalent to about $20,000 today. And after she withdrew the money, she put it in one of her dresser drawers right next to a journal that she kept where she kept track of her pregnancy. At 11 o'clock that morning, Carl had been running an errand for the butcher shop. He had to buy a new knife. On the way home, he noticed a man in front of a cigar shop, and he asked the man if he wanted a truck driving job that paid $25 a week, and the man said yes. Carl gave the man a quarter and told him to meet him a few blocks away from the butcher shop at 6:30 that evening. After work, Carl met the man as promised, and the two took a taxi to Carl's cousin Fred's house because Carl had noticed that he would need a second weapon to carry out his plan. After getting the gun, Carl and the man took the taxi close to the Wanderer home. Once they arrived, Carl asked the man if he wanted to make even more money, to which the man said of course. All he had to do was meet Carl and his wife in the vestibule and demand money from them. Carl told the man that he would give it to them, but all the man had to do was just ask for it really quickly and then quickly run away. Carl told the man to meet him around Lincoln Street at 9 o'clock that night. While Carl and Ruth were on their way home and Carl nodded to that passerby, it was actually the stranger that he was giving the go-ahead. So when the stranger ran up on Ruth and Carl in the vestibule asking for the money, he was actually doing what he was instructed to do. Carl took this chance to shoot his wife and his unborn baby, as well as the only other witness, which was the stranger. Carl had two separate trials, one for Ruth and one for the stranger. The first trial began on October 4th, 1920, just days after what would have been Carl and Ruth's first wedding anniversary. Although everyone in Chicago, including his own family, wanted Carl to be hanged for the crime, Ruth's family was on his side and they actually had faith that he was innocent. The theory that Carl was insane was explored. He had actually tried to commit suicide a few years before by throwing himself off a fire escape, and he did have a history of mental illness in his family. Nonetheless, two doctors conducted their own examinations of Carl and determined him to be perfectly sane. However, a third doctor found Carl to be insane and he labeled him as a latent homosexual. This was based on the fact that Carl had a strong desire to re-enlist in the army, and basically the doctor concluded that this was because Carl had sexual desires for men. And this is what I had touched on earlier that I won't be getting too deep into, but a lot of other news sources from the time and from today do explore the notion that maybe Carl was gay and he wasn't able to be out, which led him to murder his wife, and that his love interest that he had on the side wasn't Julia, a female, it was actually a male, and things like that. And I couldn't find anything that was verifiable, so I don't want to get too deep into that. But like I said, the Mystery of the Ragged Stranger podcast does a really well job of doing a full deep dive on all of the details of this case, so if you guys want to check that out, I'll make sure to leave the link down below. Prosecutors were confident that they had a slam dunk case, and then out of nowhere, Carl flipped the script entirely when he recanted his confession. He said he only confessed due to police pressure during interrogation, and he even accused the police of beating him. Because of this, the confession was withdrawn and could not be used in the trial. The jury was comprised of all males, and they deliberated for 22 hours and 10 minutes before reaching the final verdict. They found him guilty, but they only sentenced him to 25 years. So when you factor in good behavior, Carl would only really be in jail for about 13 years at most. The second trial began on March 1st of 1921, and this time around, Carl had a different lawyer. His new lawyer tried to argue that he had the mind of an 11-year-old, and he tried to ask the jury to not convict him, but instead to send him to a hospital for the criminally insane. Carl definitely acted the part. He started saying that his wife's ghost was haunting him. He was seeing things, and he started pacing back and forth in his cell rather. The judge for this trial didn't allow testimony from Julia, and he explained that men could love two women, basically saying how like men would cheat on their wives all the time, and it was like totally acceptable because it was being done all day, every day at that time. The trial ended on March 18th, 1921, and this time the jury only needed 22 minutes to reach a final verdict. Carl was found to be guilty, perfectly sane, and deserved to be hanged for all of his crimes. Carl tried to appeal a few times, but nothing ever came of it, and on September 20th of the year 1921, at 7:20 in the morning, Carl was hanged. To this day, the identity of the stranger remains a mystery. He was just under 6 feet tall, about 150 pounds, and he looked to be pretty young. And although he was dressed in poor clothing, kind of showing that he was homeless, he didn't have any head lice. He had like a pretty recent shave and haircut, and his fingernails weren't dirty. He didn't have like any bug bites or anything like that, like common signs that you would see from someone known to be homeless at the time. And with that, we have reached the end of this case. I wanted to do this case for two reasons. The first one being that this year it will be 100 years since this happened, which is insane to me. But secondly, because it's very interesting to me to think that a person like Carl would one day just wake up, decide that he was tired of his life, he would murder his wife, and just keep it moving. Like, did you really think you could get away with not one, not two, but three murders? I feel like, because your wife was pregnant. Like, how can you live knowing that not only did you kill your wife, but also your unborn child? Anyways, let me know what you guys think in the comments down below. Thank you guys so much for watching. I do hope that you like, comment, and subscribe, and I'll see you guys in my next video.